What if, on a sunny afternoon in Los Angeles, you witnessed a seemingly small, ordinary moment that ended up changing someone's life forever? Robert Downey Jr. had just finished a casual meet and greet with fans outside a charity function, intending to grab a quick cup of coffee before heading home. He craved a slice of normalcy away from red carpets and flashing cameras. As he stepped into a cozy cafe, a sparkle of excitement rippled through the few customers who recognized him, but Robert offered a warm nod and simply continued toward the counter. He wasn't there to bask in the spotlight. He just wanted to observe life in all its everyday beauty, something he'd learned to cherish after his own battles and triumphs. Standing behind him in line was a boy of about 13, wearing a faded red backpack and trying hard not to fidget. There was something about the way the boy's shoulders were slumped and his eyes darted nervously around the room that caught Robert's attention. The boy looked like he was carrying a weight far too heavy for someone so young. Robert recognized that look. He had seen it in his own reflection years ago during his darkest moments. Without drawing too much notice, Robert finished placing his order and stepped to the side, subtly keeping the boy in his peripheral vision. Moments later, the teen placed a timid order for a small coffee and tried to appear invisible, as if desperate not to attract any unwanted attention. Robert took a seat near the window, sipping his coffee in comfortable silence, when suddenly the boy shuffled past him. The young customer clutched his backpack and took the farthest table in the corner. It was empty and isolated, a perfect spot for someone wanting to disappear. Robert couldn't shake the sense that the boy was hiding something, sadness, fear, or both. He found himself wondering if he should approach, but he hesitated. He remembered being a teenager, how important it was to have space. Still, the boy's tense demeanor tugged at Robert's heart. As if on cue, the cafe door swung open, letting in a burst of noise from the street. 3 older students, clad in matching school jackets, strolled inside. Their loud banter filled the air as they scanned the room. The boy in the corner shrank in his seat when they made eye contact with him. Robert noticed the flicker of dread on the kid's face. The trio approached the counter, placed an order, and then pointedly looked back at the corner table. What Robert saw in their smug expressions made his chest tighten. This was no friendly reunion, it was the kind of look a predator gives its prey. Moments later, they marched over to the boy. The tallest one started mocking him in a low voice, sneering as he nudged the boy's backpack. The second boy snickered and ran a hand through his hair in a condescending way, while the third hovered with crossed arms, a silent enforcer. Robert strained to pick up bits of their conversation, hearing words laced with mean-spirited sarcasm, mocking laughter, and the kind of taunting that leaves a kid feeling worthless. He watched the boy's eyes dart down, tears threatening at the corners, knuckles turning white as he gripped his coffee cup. It was a scene Robert had witnessed too many times in his own youth, a cruelty that could crush a young spirit if no one intervened. His pulse quickened. The memory of past struggles flickered through his mind, especially those moments when a kind word or a helping hand could have made all the difference. People in the cafe glanced over but quickly looked away, hesitant to get involved. Robert set his cup down, feeling a familiar surge of determination well up inside him. He stood, quietly moving toward the corner table. The tallest bully spun around at the sound of Robert's footsteps, eyes widening in a mixture of recognition and defiance. Robert offered a calm smile, though his gaze was firm. He asked if everything was okay, his voice carrying that unmistakable blend of empathy and quiet authority. The bullies exchanged wary glances, clearly caught off guard by his presence, especially since they suddenly realized who he was. The boy with the backpack tried to wipe away any trace of tears, embarrassed to be seen this way, but Robert knelt down next to him, gently placing a hand on the back of the chair in a gesture of support. One of the bullies attempted a hollow laugh, muttering something about "mind your own business," but Robert never broke eye contact. He could feel the tension thick in the air, every patron holding their breath. Then, in a low, reassuring tone, he asked the boy for his name. The boy swallowed hard, hesitating before whispering, "My name's Mason." Robert nodded, glanced over at the trio, and calmly said that maybe they should all sit and talk. His voice carried a quiet strength that made it hard for anyone to simply walk away. Time seemed to stand still as Mason looked around, uncertain if Robert's intervention would make things better or worse. The tallest bully clenched his jaw, clearly torn between fear of embarrassment and the impulse to strike again. Outside, the sun continued shining over Los Angeles, but inside this corner of the cafe, an invisible line had been drawn. A single question lingered in the air: would kindness and courage be enough to break the cycle of cruelty? Time seemed to stand still as Robert maintained a calm yet unwavering gaze on the 3 older students. Each of them wore a flicker of uncertainty, a momentary break in their tough facade. No one in that small cafe dared to move or speak above a whisper. Outside, traffic rolled on, oblivious to the silent standoff unfolding inside. Slowly, the tallest bully shifted his weight from one foot to the other, struggling to decide whether to stay and exert power or to retreat before things escalated. Mason's eyes stayed glued to the floor, cheeks burning with a mix of humiliation and fear. He couldn't figure out if Robert's intervention was a blessing or a setup for more torment when they all returned to school. The second bully sneered, glancing at Robert with a hint of defiance. "We're just talking to our friend here," he muttered under his breath. Robert nodded, unruffled, and gently replied that friends don't usually speak with such hostility. His words were simple, but they carried enough weight to make the bullies shift uncomfortably. Finally, one of them scoffed, rolled his eyes, and said to the others, "Let's bounce." With forced bravado, they turned on their heels. On their way out, the tallest one shot Mason a pointed look as if to say, "We'll remember this." But Robert, still kneeling beside Mason, locked eyes with him and offered a quiet reassurance. He didn't need to say a word, the slight nod of his head was enough. The door slammed behind the trio, leaving the cafe buzzing with a low hum of relieved chatter. Mason held his breath, shoulders still trembling. His grip on the backpack straps relaxed just a bit. Robert remained there for another moment, making sure the boy realized it was safe to breathe again. When Mason finally looked up, there was a brief flash of recognition. He knew who Robert was, but the magnitude of meeting a famous actor took second place to the immediate relief of no longer being cornered by bullies. Robert invited him to join his table, offering a gentle smile and gesturing toward a seat. With hesitance, Mason followed. They sat down, and Robert quietly suggested that perhaps a bit of food or another drink might help calm Mason's nerves. The boy lowered his eyes and admitted he only had enough money for the small coffee he'd already bought. Without hesitation, Robert signaled to the barista for a sandwich and a bottle of water. Mason's hands trembled slightly as he accepted them, murmuring a quick thank you that was almost lost in the swirl of ambient noise. A couple of minutes passed in silence, and the tension in the cafe diffused as patrons went back to their conversations. Robert allowed Mason the time he needed to gather himself. Gradually, the boy's breathing steadied. He lifted the sandwich wrapper, took a tentative bite, and blinked as if he couldn't quite believe any of this was real. Finally, Robert leaned in, voice low and reassuring. "Tell me what's going on, kid. You look like you've been through it." Mason swallowed hard. He glanced at the door as if expecting the bullies to storm back inside. When no one appeared, he found the courage to speak, words tumbling out in a rush. He explained how this group had been picking on him since the start of the school year, targeting him for his clothes, his timid nature, or just for existing. Mason described how he tried to avoid them by arriving late or taking different routes between classes, but somehow they always found him. His backpack, the worn-out sneakers he wore, even his style of speaking had become ammunition for their ridicule. The final straw came when they spread rumors about him online, making him a laughingstock not just at school, but in social media circles he hadn't even wanted to be part of. Robert's expression darkened, a flicker of anger rising at the cruelty children could inflict on each other. He thought back to his own adolescence, the battles with insecurity, the desperate desire for acceptance, and how a single cruel remark could echo for days in your mind. Still, he forced a steady calm into his voice. "Mason, I know it feels like you're alone in this, but you're not," he said gently. "Sometimes people lash out because they're hurting inside, but that doesn't excuse them. Has anyone at school tried to help you? A teacher, a counselor?" Mason shook his head. "Nobody. They don't really see it, or if they do, they look the other way. I told my mom, but she works 2 jobs and I don't want her to worry." His voice trembled as he spoke, a mixture of resentment and heartbreak. Robert exhaled, recalling his own mother, the sacrifices she had made, and how family support could mean the difference between surviving and sinking. He placed a reassuring hand over Mason's. "Listen, it's not your fault. And you do deserve help. Adults are supposed to be there for you." Mason blinked rapidly, trying to keep himself from crying in front of a celebrity he'd only seen on movie screens. He felt an odd surge of gratitude that Robert cared enough to listen. Robert pulled out his phone, checking the time, then locked eyes with Mason. "Let's figure this out, okay? We'll get you home safely first. After that, maybe we can set up a meeting with your school." His tone was so confident, it was impossible not to believe him. Mason nodded, a tiny flame of hope flickering behind his eyes, uncertain yet desperately wanting to trust this unexpected moment of kindness. Robert gently guided Mason out of the cafe, careful to keep an eye on the street for any sign of the bullies. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, casting warm orange hues across the pavement. People bustled around them, lost in their own routines, unaware of how significantly this day might shift Mason's life. As they walked, Mason clutched the straps of his backpack and kept glancing over his shoulder, tense and ready for a confrontation that thankfully never materialized. Occasionally, Robert would ask a soft question: how his day had been, which subjects he liked at school, what he wanted to do when he got older. Mason answered in short sentences, still unsure how open he could be with this world-famous actor who had suddenly appeared in his life. They reached a bus stop, where a handful of tired commuters waited silently. Mason explained that his home was a few miles away and that he normally took the bus after school, hoping to avoid the bullies by slipping away from campus right when the bell rang. Robert studied the posted schedule and pulled out his wallet, but Mason looked at the ground, embarrassed. He admitted that the month had been tough financially, and sometimes he chose to walk part of the way to save a bit of money for a quick lunch at school. With a quiet nod, Robert dropped a few bills into the fare machine and beckoned Mason onto the bus. The driver gave them both a double take before shrugging and gesturing for them to sit wherever they liked. During the ride, Robert noticed how Mason's gaze would drift toward the windows, as if half expecting the bullies to show up at each stop. To distract him, Robert mentioned how he also loved to watch the city go by. He talked about how, in his younger days, seeing everyday people and their lives reminded him there was more to the world than the shadowy corners he'd once fallen into. Mason listened intently, though he only offered a small nod here and there. The bus jolted through traffic, and Robert realized he had no idea what Mason's home life looked like. Was the boy supported at all? Would the mother even have the bandwidth to handle a crisis like severe bullying? After 10 stops, they stepped off in a quieter neighborhood. Patches of grass grew stubbornly through cracked sidewalks, and chain-link fences guarded small, worn-down houses. Mason pointed to a plain, single-story home at the end of the block. Its front yard was littered with an abandoned tricycle and a garbage bin that appeared to have toppled over in the wind. As they approached, Mason's posture shifted, shoulders sagging under a weight that had less to do with the backpack and more to do with whatever hardships existed behind that front door. Mason unlocked the door and gestured for Robert to step inside. The interior was dimly lit, the furniture old but neatly arranged. He called out for his mother, voice wavering. From a back room emerged a weary-looking woman in scrubs, hair tied in a hasty bun. At first, she seemed about to greet her son with a worn smile, but the second she noticed Robert standing there, her eyes widened in disbelief. Mason rushed to introduce him, stumbling over his words as he attempted to explain how they'd ended up together. She stood there, stunned, covering her mouth with one hand. Robert offered a kind smile, introducing himself softly, but Mason's mother took a moment to recover from the surprise of seeing an A-list celebrity standing in her living room. In halting words, Mason explained the incident at the café, how Robert had intervened when the bullies got aggressive. Tears welled up in his mother's eyes as she listened. She clearly knew about the bullying but was distressed to discover it had escalated to this point. She worked long hours, sometimes even double shifts, and though she tried to check in with Mason, she never realized how relentless or cruel the bullying had become. Her voice trembled as she thanked Robert, apologizing for not being able to protect her son. Robert set a comforting hand on her shoulder, saying that none of this was her fault and that no parent can be everywhere at once. The mother sank onto the couch, running her fingers through Mason's hair. She asked if he was hurt, pressing him for details, her face etched with a mix of relief and guilt. Mason tried to downplay it. He didn't want to burden her after the shifts she had just worked, nor did he want to admit how close he felt to breaking under the constant harassment. Robert watched them, his heart aching. He recognized this sense of being trapped. Mason faced a world where he couldn't see a way out of misery beyond avoiding the bullies or hiding his problems from his mom. Robert knew that if there was any moment to bring hope, it was now. Before leaving, he asked if they could all sit down together and figure out a plan. The mother blinked through her tears, clearly unprepared for the idea of Robert Downey Jr. diving into her son's personal troubles. Yet the gentle sincerity in his eyes was undeniable. She nodded, grateful and overwhelmed in equal measure. Mason clutched the armrest of the couch, daring to feel just the faintest spark of optimism. It felt surreal, but maybe with Robert's help, there was a chance he could finally stand up to the cruelty that threatened to swallow him whole. That night, the three of them, Robert, Mason and Mason's mother, sat around a small wooden table in the cramped living room. A single overhead light cast gentle shadows on the walls, and the quiet hum of the refrigerator underscored the seriousness of their discussion. Mason's mother insisted that Robert sit on the only decent chair they had, one with cushions that had seen better days, while she and Mason settled on the worn-out sofa. She'd offered coffee, but Robert politely declined, wanting to stay clear-headed as they hashed out a plan. Mason explained in more detail how the bullying started with casual taunts, then escalated into humiliating pranks and social media insults. He had tried ignoring them at first, hoping they'd lose interest. When that didn't work, he tried telling a few peers, but nobody wanted to get involved. Eventually, Mason decided to keep everything locked inside, believing that no one would, or could, help. Now, with Robert sitting there, listening so intently, he felt a mixture of relief and an uncomfortable vulnerability. It wasn't every day that an A-list celebrity gave him undivided attention, and the weight of those earnest brown eyes was both comforting and disorienting. Robert turned to Mason's mother and suggested they meet with the school principal. He believed that the administration needed to be held accountable for student safety. She nodded wearily, explaining she'd already tried to set up meetings in the past, but her busy schedule made it hard to follow through, and sometimes the school officials brushed off her concerns. Robert's jaw tensed. He'd experienced plenty of bureaucratic runarounds in his own life, but this was a child at stake. "I'll go with you," he offered. "I know I'm just a stranger to the principal, but maybe we can't be ignored if we show up together." Mason's mother blinked, absorbing the proposal. She felt both gratitude and a tinge of embarrassment. She'd never imagined Robert Downey Jr. would be stepping into her personal struggles like this. Still, that flicker of hope glimmered again. "We can try," she said, voice shaky. "He's usually there early in the morning. Maybe I can talk to my manager and see if I can come in late tomorrow." Robert nodded, encouraging her to make the call right then and there. She hesitated, but the resolve in his eyes was contagious. After a few minutes on her phone, she managed to negotiate a late start at work. Tomorrow morning they would confront the situation head-on. Mason exhaled deeply, relief and anxiety mingling in his chest. The idea of facing those bullies again or sharing his humiliations with the principal made his stomach churn, yet it also felt like the first time he might truly be heard. Robert, noticing the teens fidgeting, offered a quiet reassurance. "It's normal to be nervous. I get stage fright sometimes, even after all these years in front of cameras. But when you care about something, you find the courage to speak up." That statement seemed to resonate in the small living room. Mason's mother reached over and squeezed her son's hand, grateful to see some optimism return to his eyes. The next morning came too quickly. Robert arrived in a modest rental car, having chosen not to draw more attention by rolling up in anything flashy. Mason wore a plain hoodie, trying to remain inconspicuous as they drove to the school. His mother's knuckles were white against the steering wheel of her own car, following closely behind. The hallways were already buzzing with students rushing to their first class, many of them pausing in disbelief at the sight of Robert walking down the corridor. Teachers did double takes, while some kids whispered excitedly among themselves. Mason felt a bit self-conscious, but he also couldn't deny the small swell of pride that came from having someone like Robert at his side. They reached the principal's office, a room with pale walls and a large wooden desk. The principal, a somewhat stern man in his late 40s, stood up in shock when he recognized Robert. Quick introductions followed, and Robert explained the situation in calm but firm tones. He said that, while he understood no school could be perfect, students like Mason shouldn't be living in fear daily. The principal's demeanor wavered. He was obviously concerned about the school's reputation, especially with a celebrity present. Mason's mother chimed in with tearful frustration about how many times she tried to get help for her son, only to be brushed off. The principal listened, nodding, but it was hard to tell if he was truly empathetic or simply worried about bad publicity. Just then there was a knock at the door. A guidance counselor stepped in, looking flustered. She apologized for interrupting, but she had just received a report of a confrontation in the hallway involving the same group of boys. One of them apparently shoved a smaller student into a locker, and tensions were running high. Mason's heart lurched, fearing it might be a friend or acquaintance. Robert and Mason's mother exchanged concerned looks, while the principal stood up so abruptly that his chair squeaked across the floor. Without wasting a second, they all hurried out of the office, the counselor leading the way. The corridors thrummed with nervous energy as students pressed against the walls, trying to avoid getting caught in the middle of any trouble. Robert kept an arm gently on Mason's shoulder, both to guide him and to reassure him. Up ahead, a cluster of teenagers stood around a shaking underclassman, while one of the bullies turned at the sound of approaching adults. Mason recognized him instantly. The bully's face flickered with surprise, then hardened with defiance. In the space of a heartbeat, the principal's stern voice echoed through the hallway, demanding an explanation. Robert felt Mason tense beside him. He could sense that this moment, no matter how brief, might be the turning point in a story that had spiraled too far into darkness. And he intended to see it through no matter what. The group of boys froze when they caught sight of the principal marching toward them, flanked by Robert, Mason, and Mason's mother. The tension in the hallway was palpable. One of the older bullies glared at Mason with an expression that was part surprise, part resentment. Mason stood there, shoulders trembling despite Robert's reassuring hand on his back. The underclassman who'd been shoved into a locker was still clutching his backpack, eyes wide with fear. Almost instinctively, Robert stepped forward, placing himself protectively between the bully and the smaller student, an unspoken reminder that the days of targeting the defenseless were coming to an end. The principal's voice echoed throughout the corridor. He demanded to know what had happened, gesturing for nearby students to disperse and go to class. The crowd thinned, yet a few lingered near the lockers, too curious or concerned to leave. Robert shot the bully a steady look, and in that moment, Mason could almost see the bravado slip from the bully's face. It was easy to be menacing when no one of authority was watching, but things looked different under the principal's scrutiny, and certainly in front of Robert Downey Jr. Mason's heart still pounded in his chest. He wondered if these tormentors would retaliate after all this attention faded. Yet for once he saw the bullies hesitate. Their ringleader mumbled something about the underclassmen getting in the way. The principal, flanked by the guidance counselor, was having none of it. He ordered them to report immediately to the office. It was an abrupt shift in tone from the cool indifference Mason had encountered before. Perhaps the added presence of a high-profile witness jolted the administration into taking real action. Regardless of the motive, it signaled a shift that had been long overdue. The principal then guided everyone back toward his office, where a long and uncomfortable conference ensued. The bullies had to sit and listen as Mason, prompted carefully by Robert and his mother, detailed the months of taunting and physical intimidation. The underclassman, still shaky from his locker ordeal, added his own account. The guidance counselor scribbled notes, looking aghast at how deep the problem ran. The principal's demeanor hardened as he grasped the full extent of the bullying. He informed the older boys that immediate disciplinary measures would be taken, and that their parents would be involved. One of them clenched his fists and muttered an apology through gritted teeth, but it felt more performative than sincere. Mason quietly wondered if they'd ever genuinely regret their actions or simply regret getting caught. Though exhausted by the confrontation, Mason felt a swelling relief in his chest. For the first time he'd been heard. Moreover, he'd stood, albeit shakily, beside someone who refused to let him be dismissed or silenced. Robert, noticing the boy's mixture of triumph and fatigue, gave him a small nod. Outside the office, Mason's mother wiped away tears, repeating her thanks to Robert. He pulled her into a gentle hug, reassuring her that she had nothing to apologize for. She'd done the best she could under the circumstances, and now the school would be forced to pay attention. Classes were still in session when they finally emerged. A bell had just rung and students were filing to their next period. Some gawked openly at Robert in the hallway, while others cast curious glances at Mason, as if discovering an unexpected new side to the quiet kid they'd overlooked. Robert asked the principal if there could be a broader conversation about bullying at the school. The principal nodded solemnly, promising staff meetings, anti-bullying assemblies, and stricter enforcement. Time would tell if those words rang hollow, but at least a spark of change had been lit. Outside in the parking lot, sunlight warmed the asphalt. The tension that had weighed on them moments ago lifted, replaced by cautious hope. Mason hovered near Robert, uncertain how to express everything he felt. Relief mixed with gratitude, but there was also a gnawing worry about what would happen when Robert wasn't around. As if sensing his concern, Robert kneeled to Mason's level. "They're not going to win," he said quietly. "This was just step one. If it ever gets bad again, you let me or the school know. And don't ever think you're alone in this." Mason tried to speak, but his voice cracked. His mother placed a hand on her son's shoulder, and he nodded bravely, eyes glistening. She thanked Robert again, promising to stay vigilant and to keep the school accountable. Robert gave them each one more reassuring look, then exchanged numbers with Mason's mother. "Anytime you need me," he said simply. Despite the surreal nature of it all, she believed him. They parted ways, Mason feeling an unfamiliar sense of lightness in his step. The walk back to class still felt intimidating. He might face stares, questions, and maybe even new forms of harassment. But something vital had changed. He no longer believed he had to fight this battle alone. There were people willing to stand up for him, and that knowledge was like a small ember of courage glowing in his chest. As Robert slid into the driver's seat of his rental car, he exhaled slowly, recalling his own tumultuous past. He knew firsthand how words, and the absence of support, could haunt a person for years. If he'd offered any comfort to Mason, or even planted the idea that life held possibilities beyond pain, then this day had been more meaningful than any premiere or award ceremony. He started the ignition with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to keep in contact with Mason and his mother, and to continue pushing for greater awareness of the damage bullying can do. If you found hope and strength in this story, there's more where it came from. Subscribe and stay tuned for more heartfelt tales that uplift and inspire, because sometimes one act of kindness, one refusal to stay silent, can spark a transformation for everyone involved.